Madam Deputy Speaker, there is a global illegal migration crisis. As I've stated many times, these journeys across the Channel are absolutely unnecessary. But as I have been warning for 2 years, they are also lethally dangerous. What happened yesterday was a dreadful shock. It was not a surprise, but it is also a reminder of how vulnerable people are put at peril when in the hands of criminal gangs.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. This week, refugees. More than 24 of them in a rubber raft attempted to make their way from France to Britain across the English Channel. Now many make that journey safely, and some don't. This trip, which included a pregnant woman and children, ended in disaster. 27 died. People smugglers, criminal gangs probably earned about $10,000 per person. That's $250,000 for that fatal trip. The criminals are to blame, but so is Britain's Conservative government, which has gotten tough on the weak and desperate, fleeing conflict zones like Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan. On this Backstory, we talk to a charity which has spent years trying to help the hopeless, those refugees, and a Times columnist here in London who has called Britain's treatment of refugees a Hunger Games policy against the hopeless and homeless. Joining me now is longtime journalist and author Edward Lucas, who is also campaigning for the Liberal Democrat Party in Westminster. Hi, Ed.
Hello.
Look, first of all, can I just get your reaction? I mean, these drownings that have occurred, 27 people, including a pregnant woman and children in the English Channel, are pretty horrendous.
It's horrendous, and all the more horrendous because it's part of a horrendous saga. We don't know how many people have died from drowning in the English Channel. We do know that people have died trying to get to Britain in other ways, notably with a container on the back of a truck where lots of people suffocated to death. And what this really shows is the government's attempt to close down migration and asylum claims through deterrence simply isn't working. It just encourages people to take greater risks and gives even more profits to the people traffickers.
And yet, all of the talk today from the Conservative government in Britain is to get tougher.
I don't know how you could get tougher, really. We are an island with a coastline. France is quite close. They can't move Britain further away. And they've tried every form of deterrence, compatible and perhaps even not compatible with international law. What we really need is a safe way for people to claim asylum, which doesn't involve this kind of Hunger Games ordeal, which gives a big advantage to the younger and stronger and not necessarily most deserving. But we've closed down every safe and legal way of applying for asylum in this country, and this is the only one left, so people are taking it.
Why are they closing down every possible route to the United Kingdom when many people say that they take far less refugees in the UK than they do in other parts of Europe, and that Britain has an obligation to take some of these people?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, the numbers involved are tiny. They're actually conspicuous now because we see them coming on these boats, whereas previously they maybe came in the back of trucks and were not so immediately visible. But the enormous numbers of refugees are in countries like Iran, from Afghanistan, Turkey, Syria. That's where the real burden of refugees is. And these are numbers in the thousands, perhaps the tens of thousands. And we have a responsibility in Britain to treat people fairly. Every one of these people is an individual, and every one of them has the right to claim asylum. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll get asylum, although I would hope that many of them would. And the paradox is, of course, that in Britain we actually have a labour shortage right now, and many of these people are super keen to work and often very highly skilled. and that the government is absolutely imprisoned by the kind of logical trap they've created for themselves, where they say migration is a threat, foreigners are bad, it's about terrorism, it's undermining our system, it's undermining social cohesion. And so they go headline hunting, and the result is that people die.
Priti Patel, the Home Secretary for the United Kingdom, said today that the government's not, quote, heartless, and she said that they have a humane approach to asylum seekers. What would you say?
Well, if this is humane, I'd like to see what inhumane looks like. I mean, it's also worth noting there's an enormous backlog. People wait for years for their claims to be processed. And the policy of a hostile environment to illegal immigrants and the idea that you can sort of deter people with the threat of destitution all helps make people miserable and doesn't mean they don't contribute to the economy, and gives perhaps some cheap headlines for the government. But it's not the way that a civilized country should be going about this. And of course, we have to have national borders, and we need to protect them. But what we're actually doing is encouraging people to attack our borders through this kind of criminal industry of migration. And the only people who benefit from this are actually the people traffickers, who are making huge amounts of money. And I can't see really how the government can succeed in this approach when they've basically tried everything that is legal and some things that are perhaps not legal.
Edward, you were here for the Brexit campaign when Boris Johnson and other conservatives were running across the country, really stirring up a lot of fear before the vote to leave the European Union about immigration and about people, flooding across the borders. Have they kind of created their own mousetrap here, where they suddenly cannot be more humane and they can't get softer with people because they whipped up this hysteria?
I think that there is a genuine problem in this country about access to public services. And that's where it starts. People say, I can't get my kid into a local school. I can't get an appointment to see my GP. I can't get social housing. And that strain is the result of years and years of neglect, going back not just to this government, its predecessor, but actually to Tony Blair's government, which allowed East Europeans to come from the new member states here without thinking about public service provision. And that's created a genuine sense of grievance. And I think people are right to be cross about that. You pay your taxes, you should have access to public services, and you worry if you think people are jumping the queue. But what has happened is that grievance has been weaponized, has been instrumentalized as a kind of political tool by the Conservative Party. And with this kind of chest-beating idea, we're defending Britain by keeping these foreigners out. And the problem with that is it's both morally questionable, but it also just doesn't work. It creates the demand and the supply for a very lucrative criminal industry, which kills quite a lot of its customers in the most gruesome and despicable way, through drowning at sea.
It is gruesome. I would ask you, just as a last question to you, what do you think would be the immediate answer, rather than getting harsher and pressing the French, in joint patrols? And Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, has talked about pushbacks with boats, which I think even the United Nations has called her out on. What would be a partial answer? Is that to allow people to come here in a reasonable way, a reasonable form of transportation openly, and then apply for refugee status here, rather than trying to push them back across the channel or force them into taking these containers and other horrible forms of travel where they perish?
Well, I would open asylum processing centres in the countries that are most hard hit by war and climate change and so on, and say, if this is where you're being persecuted, there's a place you can go to right here in Turkey, in Lebanon, in Iran, if we could manage it. We have a particular responsibility to Afghanistan, having made such a mess of our intervention there.
Indeed.
And that would mean that you don't start off by thinking, I've got to go a quarter of the way around the world in horrible conditions, all the way through the Balkans and across Europe in order to get to Calais, in order then to try and get across the Channel. And this is this sort of Hunger Games approach where you make it into an absolute ordeal. And if you say your best chance of getting asylum and be able to get legal, and I would actually also offer migration visas as well, where you come in for 5 years and try and, get yourself established in Britain. So I wouldn't say it's only asylum seekers who should be allowed to come. But if you process those people in a humane and efficient way on the spot, then you will not have these refugee camps and migration camps growing up on the coast of France, because what's the point? You can apply in Turkey, you can apply in Pakistan, you can apply in India. And we can do this with biometric checks and so on and make sure people are who they say they are. Now, that won't completely wipe out the criminal business of trying to get people into this country who perhaps don't have any legitimate asylum claim, and perhaps are not the sort of migrants that any country would choose to want. But at least you've taken the humanitarian sting out of this. And there's plenty more we could do as well. But I think that the fundamental thing, you've got to be honest with the voters and admit this isn't working. It's cruel and inefficient, and it creates wonderful business opportunities for some of the nastiest people in the world.
And sets the stage for these tragic events on the English Channel. Edward Lucas, great to talk to you.
It's my pleasure. Thanks.
All right, Claire Mosley joins us from Britain, and she runs Care for Calais, which is a charitable organization that helps refugees. And I can tell you firsthand as a reporter who's been in Calais. First of all, hi, Claire.
Hi.
I think you guys have done some great work. I mean, people don't realize, how grim and rugged and difficult it is for these people who arrive in France hoping to cross the English Channel and wind up sleeping in the mud, cold, miserable conditions. And a lot of them get pushed around by the French police who are trying to enforce the border.
Yes, unfortunately, Calais is it's not a nice place at all for a refugee. Most of them are sleeping rough. When they put up tents, generally the French police take them away. They take away their sleeping bags. Sometimes they even take away their clothes. Now we're getting into winter. That becomes very dangerous. We get worried about hypothermia. When people get wet, they don't have a way to get their clothes dry, which is grim and dangerous. There's no proper sanitation. There's very limited access to showers or water, and they don't have anywhere to clean their clothes. And of course, the effect of being continually woken up and moved on by the police means that they hardly ever get a night's unbroken sleep, which, sleep deprivation is a form of torture. So it's very serious. And right now in Calais, they have a food ban as well. So there's actually quite a lot of the town where we are forbidden from giving people food. It's actually a crime to give food to a hungry person in places in Calais.
What?
Yeah.
It's a crime for you as an aid agency to help people who are hungry, with kids and older people and women and pregnant women. And
yeah. And they're expanding the area that it covers more and more. So it's getting more and more difficult for us to get food to people.
So a lot of this has been
not even legal in Europe, but that's what they're doing.
But a lot of this has been pushed by the United Kingdom, has it not? I mean, they've been pushing and paying the French authorities to get tougher on these people, and then the town of Calais doesn't want them there at all.
No, you're right. But it's really important, and people don't always realise that the border policy is jointly managed by the British and the French. So everything that happens, Britain not only has a say in, but is actually funding. So this is not just a case of, the French shouldn't be doing that. It is a joint border policy. And it's all based around deterrence. They have this idea that if they make life hard enough, people will go away. But they've been doing it for 10 years now, and it's never, ever made any kind of a difference, which is a mountain of evidence that it's not working. All the theory about refugees says policies based on deterrence don't work because, of course, the things that refugees are running from are the worst things in the world. They're running from conflicts, they're running from torture, they're running from persecution. So based on that, the theory says that deterrence won't work. And guess what? They've been trying it for 10 years and it hasn't worked.
Yeah, and by the way, if you've ever been to Calais, which most people have not, I was shocked when I went there as a reporter. It looks like a very large maximum security prison on the outskirts of Calais, where there are fences after fences after fences and tall barbed wire and patrols, and where there have been a lot of different allegations, Claire, against the French authorities in their frustrated attempts to stop these people from jumping on ferries or getting under trucks, of beating people and being very tough on refugees who are persistent and don't want to go away.
Yes, I mean, it's been described as the shame of Britain and France, and I think that's fair, to be honest. I really do.
So the British newspapers today don't share your view. They're pointing all of the blame after this, terrible tragedy in the English Channel, which we could all see coming. The Metro, why didn't France stop them? Daily Mail, you're letting gangs get away with murder, and they're showing a picture of French police. They're shameful. Another headline says French police idly look on as rafts head to the to the United Kingdom. Is France to blame?
Really, I'm not sure that it is. I mean, as we said, France is following the policy that is agreed with the UK. The UK government has put itself in a very difficult position by vowing to stop these crossings, which of course it hasn't been able to do. But the way that it's trying to stop them is the way that, like I say, has been tried year upon year upon year and has never stopped them. So making this very public commitment and saying they were going to stop them was possibly a foolish thing to do.
Priti Patel just stood in Parliament today saying the government is not heartless.
Yeah. Well, Priti Patel stood up last week and said that most of the people in Calais were economic migrants, but there is evidence, hard evidence on Parliament's website, very recent evidence that shows that the majority of people that come across from Calais not only claim asylum, but are granted asylum. So, there is evidence that they are genuine refugees, and yet she stood up last week and said that there wasn't, and I'm fairly sure she's aware of that evidence that's on Parliament's website.
She seems pretty heartless, I gotta say. I mean, she's considered nets to stop boats. Pushback. Mm-hmm. What is pushback in your organization has taken a lawyer now to say that that's illegal?
There are various opinions that say that it's illegal under international refugee law, and it is incredibly dangerous. This is the idea of actually stopping the boats mid-channel and forcibly turning them back. And as I'm sure
pushing them with another boat and saying you can't be in the UK waters, and shoving one of those rafts back that these people died on, shoving them back into French waters where they may have to make another dangerous trip to try to get back to land and most likely will sink.
It's not a position that I would have ever dreamt that the UK would be taking. To me, it's really deeply shocking that my country, that our country, is considering something like this, because it is extreme, it's dangerous. It puts politics above people's lives. And that's not something I ever thought that we would see our country do.
I've heard you say that before. I mean, the French police have stopped 20,000 people this year. So to suggest that the French aren't doing anything is, a bit of is a lie, I think. I mean, they are. Are they doing something in every single case? I mean, I guess that's to be known between the French and English authorities. But it seems like, I don't want to steal terms from the headlines, but it is a blame game where both countries don't want refugees. They don't want to help these people. They don't want to allow them to have camps where they could make legal application to stay in a European country, whether that be the United Kingdom or France or otherwise. And they just want to shove them back and not have them under any circumstances. And in the meantime, just blame each other.
Well, to be absolutely fair, France takes 3 or 4 times as many refugees as the UK every single year. And once you moved outside of Calais, France is looking after people. They are taking a significant number of refugees every single year. It's only the ones in Calais that are being treated this badly, and that is because of the British border policy. It is the UK that is so strongly averse to taking refugees. And I really think that we need to ask why, because the UK takes far fewer refugees than not only France, but Germany, Italy, Spain. A lot of our European neighbours, we take much fewer refugees. And yet I know that people in the UK are not less compassionate than, other European countries. I know that it's not that we don't care. I do know that there's a big misconception out there about who people are in Calais, that they are portrayed as these scary economic migrants who are coming to take your jobs or your home. But we also know that that is not true, and that there is factual evidence to back up the fact that they're genuine refugees. And I know that people in the UK do care about genuine refugees because their stories are horrific. We hear them time and time again. We talk to people who have been sold as slaves in Libya, who have been tortured horrifically in Iraq, people who have seen their family members starve to death in Yemen, people who have lost family members in the war in Syria. These are the worst places in the world where the most horrific things happen to them. And I know that when people hear those stories, when they meet them, when they hear who they are, they want to help them. It's not that British people don't care. So why is our government so determined that we don't help them?
I was shocked, Claire, when I was there just with children. I mean, if you want to get away from all of the adults, if people find it hard to relate to a 25-year-old single male who's made the trip, trying to get to the United Kingdom for a better life. Okay, if they can't relate to that, which they should, but if they can't, the number of kids that were walking around some of these camps and in the forests and at risk of, sexual assault or whatever may become of them. The French authorities knew they were there. The British knew they were there. And they all kind of turned their cheeks another way and turned their backs on them as well. And these were young kids that I spoke to and said that their parents had sent them away. One of them, I remember saying I think he was 12 or 13 and just had walked from Afghanistan. And he was there with nothing except the food that Care for Calais was giving him.
Yeah, and it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking when you see a child sitting in the mud in the forest alone, or when you meet a child who will say to you, my father was killed by the Taliban, or even worse, and I saw it. I mean, we've heard stories like that. They've now announced there was a pregnant woman on board this boat that sank. I know that when people hear the truth and hear the stories, they will care. I'm absolutely convinced of it, and I've seen it. Everyone who ever comes to Calais goes home a changed person. They really do. Is
that why the government always labels them migrants? Like, you don't hear about people, you hear about like migrants, like they're coming here for work, like they're coming to illegally pick vegetables in a field or something. Is that why the government seems to dehumanize them?
The language that gets used, is absolutely shocking. In the last 12 months, I couldn't tell you the amount of times that I have heard Boris Johnson talk about illegal immigrants. They are illegal immigrants. If you come to this country, you're an illegal immigrant and you will be treated as such. But the fact is, they are refugees. The reason that they are crossing the channel illegally is because there is no safe and legal way for them to come to the UK. If there was a safe way that they could come and have their asylum claims heard, they would take it. They don't want to get in a small boat.
So how does that happen? Because if you could just walk me through that, because that's obviously the answer, right? That they are able to legally apply from some place. I understand the UK government would rather have them apply from Syria or Afghanistan, but, that's almost impossible for most people in a war zone. I've been to those places. There's no embassy that you can walk up to and make a luncheon appointment at, right? So how do those people apply? And in the meantime, the British government kind of plays this smoke and mirrors game where they say, you should apply to the first country that you land in. In other words, you didn't land in the UK, so don't apply to us under any circumstances.
Yeah, when it's practically impossible to land in the UK.
Right.
So that's very convenient.
So what would be a solution?
The essence of being a refugee is you're coming from a conflict zone where you're not going to have a passport or a visa. You might have lived in a country where there's a dictatorship and they are never going to issue a visa for travel. The things that you're coming from, they might have lost everything. They might have lost their house and their home, and they're not going to have a passport. So traveling illegally is part of being a refugee. So to say that we don't want anybody who travels illegally is pretty much saying we don't want refugees. So, it's completely wrong, and it's unfair, and it's very manipulative.
So how do you handle them if they're sitting in the forest in a tent in France? What would be a good solution where the UK government says, okay, we will help people if they deserve to come, and that's a whole nother discussion. But what should they be doing so that they're able to apply, or should they at least allow them to land here and then apply once they land?
Well, there's been a lot of work done on how it could work, and there's different ways, but I think probably the best way would be some kind of initial screening or assessment in France that says, is this person likely to have a valid claim for asylum? And then if they are, then they are safely transferred to the UK to have a full assessment here, because that's what removes the dangerous journey. And the other thing that it does is it completely breaks the model of people smugglers, because I have heard 100 times today politicians saying we want to get rid of people smugglers, we want to break the model for people smugglers. Well, that would do it. Remove the situation where they have no other choice, give them a safe way to travel, and the people smugglers will go out of business overnight. So, there is an alternative. We just have to have the will to find it. And if we could do that, we're not saying an open borders policy, we're not saying let everybody in, we're saying fairly assess their claims, see if they have a genuine claim. There still has to be a process, but it's a controlled process. And most importantly, it's a safe process, so nobody else dies. We don't want to see these tragedies in the Channel. We don't want innocent people to have to risk their lives. We don't want people who have already suffered the worst things in the world to have to risk their life again just to claim asylum in the UK.
How does the Conservative government of Prime Minister Boris Johnson do that when largely he campaigned during Brexit and some of the people around him on the fear of Britons that, waves of people were coming to take their jobs and take away their jobs and take away their livelihoods? And they campaigned on that fear. And by the way, a lot of people assessed that was one of the greatest motivating factors for people who supported the Brexit decision to leave the European Union. How does he now turn around and say we're going to be more humane? And Priti Patel, who, you wouldn't expect that she's going to do that.
Well, the facts, again, it comes back to the facts and the truth. The facts and the truth are that, firstly, the numbers are not that big. They're really not. I mean, we are a country of 60 million people. At the end of the day, 30,000 asylum seekers is nothing. You will go through the whole of your life without ever having met one, because it's such a tiny number in our context. And it's so much less than all these other European countries are taking. We are only taking a few. So they have to get over the fear factor. If there's a day when we find that we are taking so many refugees that we can't handle them, then at that point, then we need to consider what to do. But we are nowhere near that point right now. We are nowhere near that point. So, let's not worry about it until it happens. The other thing is that people need to understand. I think some of this has come from COVID and Brexit. There have been issues with getting enough foreign workers into the country because of COVID and Brexit. So maybe people are seeing things a little bit more differently now. Maybe there will be a little bit more welcoming, because not just from a compassionate point of view, from a common sense point of view, we do need foreign workers. But refugees are only a tiny, tiny portion of that. I think the year before Brexit, there were 600,000 people came to live in the UK, 600,000, and only 30,000 of them are refugees. So refugees are only a tiny part of the number of people that are coming to live in our country. So we do really need to get over that fear thing, because it's not accurate and it's not true. And misunderstandings are the biggest problem that we do have with refugees. They really are.
Final question to you. I know you've been on TV a lot today in Britain, but you've been also watching it, and you've been hearing every time one of these tragedies happen. This is one of the worst ones. It is the worst one in the Channel. There have been others where, people have suffocated in containers that were being shipped over, and there are many others that have drowned. When you hear the reactions today, does it give you hope, or does it really kind of make you sad that the first thing you hear is we're going to get tougher? They're going to do joint patrols. They're going to press the French to turn these people back even more, pushbacks. It seems like the talk always seems to get tougher rather than more humane somehow.
Most unfortunately, it is mostly the second one. I have heard a lot of talk about how we're going to get tougher. And the problem with that is that every single year for the last 6 years, I've heard that. Every single year, I've heard the same headlines. We're going to spend more money on security. We're going to cooperate more with the French. We're going to get tougher. And I know that it makes no difference, because it never does. It simply never makes a difference. I guess the ray of hope is that in all the interviews that I've done today, most of them have had more of a political focus, and that's where, they've been more news type interviews where people are talking about getting tougher. But a couple of them have been more, I guess, what ordinary people are thinking, more human interest type, breakfast show stories where the focus isn't 100% on politics. And on those shows, there is much more compassion. On those shows, there is more talk about the actual people, because these are ordinary people, innocent people who, basically were just born in the wrong place, but that is not their fault. And most of us in the UK are ordinary people, so we care about them. And ordinary people do. Ordinary people have compassion. It's just, unfortunately, the politics of the country is devoid of it.
Yeah, and I think, Claire, when you see people in, as I've seen them in those tents with freezing kids next to them, sharing a little bit of cooking oil and some bread and maybe something out of a tin, stuck really with no hope and no way to go forward and no way to go back. It's pretty tragic. Do you, for Care for Calais, are you still able to give food and clothing and help people? And if so, how do people help you? Just to conclude.
We are still out there 365 days of the year. We are still looking every day for ways to give people food and clothes. It's getting harder, but we never stop doing it. The volunteers are literally out every morning and every night finding people. We need volunteers, we need money. Getting stuff across the border has got harder because of COVID and Brexit. Both of them are really difficult for us. So help is always welcome. Just go to our website and look how to get involved. We are careforcalais.org.
That's care, and then the numeral 4, and then Calais. So Claire Mosley, great to see you again, this time in a more dry place. But hopefully we'll see you out there again as well. And it's great to talk to you. Thank you so much.
You too. Thank you.
And that's our backstory. Please sign up to the podcast so you get it weekly. And I also do a newsletter. You can find it at danalewis.substack.com. And that goes out a few days a week to let you know what's going on in our world. Thanks for listening to Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.